I'm just saying
That's the most
it.
annoying of the Popperian habits, I think.
Nice.
Just to let you know,
Yeah.
like.
Yeah, we'll try and get you in hot water with all the philosophers, convert you to Popper, and then you'll be ostracized from your own
Tamler
department.
Sommers destroyed by non-philosophers. Yeah. Ben, what's your background?
So I'm in the middle of a PhD in statistics and machine learning.
In statistics. So I want to talk
Yeah.
to you maybe separately about like my book. With statistics, just generally, I'm especially interested in social science statistics and the way they're used.
Yeah, I was a little scared of saying, because I'm assuming I'm going to be on the receiving end of your wrath in the upcoming book. But I also actually have a lot of opinions on the misuse of statistics, and I'm quite critical of statistics in most fields, to be honest. And so sometimes I feel a little, speaking of being ostracized, I feel a little confused about what exactly it is that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. But
I find that seems true about a lot of people who work in statistics, that they're very critical to the point of thinking whole like areas are just operating on like a Ponzi scheme of bad statistical methodologies. But then it's like, yeah, but what are you going to do? It's like, wow.
we gotta change.
Got to pay the bills.
Got to do something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something to being sort of like black-pilled by really studying the math behind all the statistics, and you realize all the assumptions and stuff that are going in. And then, so you're dealing with all this math all day, and then you take a step back and you realize, like, wait a second, are any of these assumptions being met in practice? Like, is any of this applicable at all?
Right.
And you realize that, I mean, especially social scientists, right? They're not trained formally in statistics. So one shouldn't expect that they always know exactly what to do. And statistics as a profession has not been good in its communication, I think. So there's just problem upon problem, and it's compounded into this current state of affairs, which is great.
My problem is I just don't know. I don't know how statistics works exactly, and I've never taken a statistics course, and I think that's going to be the thing that fucks me as I work on this. I'm either going to have to take a basic statistics course or figure out a way to do this without that, So we'll see. Stay tuned.
Social sciences and psychology never used to be so statistical, right?
Right.
It seems like a trend over the last 50, 60 years. And it's not as if people didn't have brilliant insights in Freudian land and stuff. And so what is with this trend?
There's a history behind that, actually, that traces back to these conferences that they had in the 40s. And, obviously wanting to be thought of more like the hard sciences, being a little embarrassed by Freud, and just agreeing on a way of defining measurement. So a lot of this stuff involves measurement and operationalizing things, and they just kind of agreed that they were going to do it like this. But then when you there's an interesting paper in Theory and Psychology where they give the reports of this conference and what they think they're actually doing. And the answers of Skinner and all these other people, Stevens, were just completely different. They had a completely different understanding of what it is that they were even talking about. But somehow they all just agreed to use these kinds of methods. And then it's been like that ever since. But like you said, it didn't used to be.
A name that I just discovered. Do you know Paul Meehl? By any chance?
Yes.
M-E-E.
I've been reading a lot of Paul Meehl stuff.
Yeah, so he's brilliant, and he's kind of right at talking and writing at the time when this trend, I think, is starting to accelerate. And there's a lecture series of his on YouTube. You can actually see him speak for 10 lectures or whatever.
On this stuff,
on all this stuff. And it's completely peppered in with just tiny anecdotes of him arguing with B.F. Skinner and all these classic big names and things. And I think he might be an interesting person to dive into, to get arguments at the time that it was starting to shoot up.
He definitely is. And his whole career, he has a paper in 1990 that is kind of sums up and also has some just funny accounts of like, everybody knows that I believe this and nobody has, come up with a way to, but they just assume, well, he's got to be wrong somehow, or else everything I've been doing is built on a lie. And then he's like, but it doesn't,
And also a Popperian.
Yeah.
I don't know if you knew that connection, but significantly influenced by.
He's a Popperian?
Yeah, he
Right.
is. Yeah.
I'm much more wedded to Paul Meal than I am to like anti-Popper. So
yeah.
Nice.
Well, anyway, shall we?
Let's get going.
Yeah, I guess we should actually introduce you and stuff. All right, so we're here with Tamler Sommers, professor of philosophy at the University of Houston, co-host, of course, of the Very Bad Wizards podcast. And I noticed on your Google Scholar profile, a professional or an expert in Kant hatred. So, Tamler, thanks.
Is that what it says?
Yeah, that's what it says. So thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we're excited to have you not only to argue about induction, which is going to be the main theme, I think, of this episode, but also because Very Bad Wizards, hosted, I should say, by you and David Pizarro, was one of the major influences on us when deciding if we should start this podcast. Vaden has since sold out to industry, but back when we started, he was also in academia, and so we were, two academics, and wondering if the world needed another philosophy of academics yelling at each other about various subjects in philosophy and science. So thank you. I don't know if the world thanks you for that, but we thank you for that, for sure.
Well, it seems like you guys are doing pretty well. So, honored to have played a small role in getting you guys started.
There's one more detail about that, and you obviously won't remember this, but we've actually met before. And it was when you and David were in Vancouver for this podcast.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And,
I did not make it through that night fully conscious.
Not at all. I think you dreamed out within the first 45 minutes.
Seriously.
It was so funny. Yeah,
it's because I hadn't gotten my edible doses down right, but then also just every like UBC undergrad was like, here, let's go get stoned outside or do a shot, or here, getting you a shot, and so like it was just completely like I had no chance. There was no hope of me leaving that bar fully upright on my own.
It was so funny. Yeah, it was a great first impression. But
yeah, I remember you guys discussing that that period afterwards on an episode, and I think there was some girl there who had an accent, and she was trying to talk to you about manual cars, and you were confused about why she kept bringing up manual cars, and then you realized after about half an hour of her talking about manual cars, she was actually talking about Immanuel Kant, but had an accent.
I don't even remember that, but that sounds right. Yeah. I mean, I'll talk about manual cars. I haven't owned an automatic car in my whole life up till today. So, I mean, if you guys want to talk about, I know your generation doesn't know how to do that, but
the problem of transmission.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have a bona fide philosopher on the podcast, so maybe we'll just turn it over to you, seeing as you guys did an episode on induction recently, which is hence the invite, why we wanted to have you on to talk about it. We sort of disagreed with your takes on the problem, but maybe we'll just get you to introduce the problem briefly and where you're sort of at with it, and then we can just dive into the disagreements from there.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I'm not a philosopher of science. My knowledge of this problem is a result of taking some philosophy of science classes in grad school and learning about the problem and then just doing a bunch of reading. But basically, the problem, as Hume laid it out, is in the form of a kind of dilemma where we want to know how we can justify making, the part of the problem of induction that I think Hume was focusing on is using induction to predict the future. So it seems like a lot of the time, I know that you're going to dispute this, but it seems like a lot of the time you look at regularities in nature, and based on those regularities, you expect certain things to happen in the future because that's how they've gone in the past. Maybe you even have a theory about it, but the basic idea is you observe these regularities, these constant conjunctions, because he was an empiricist. He thought we could never observe causation. All we can observe is things happening one right after the other, and over and over and over and over again. So anyway, we observe these regularities, and we take that as license to expect certain things in the future. The classic example being just the sun. The sun will rise tomorrow morning, and the sun will rise in the east. And he says, so what justifies this inference of going from all these things that have happened in the past? I see these patterns, and then imagining, this same kind of thing will happen in the future. And he found that he couldn't rationally justify that, because if you wanted to do a kind of deductive justification, that's not going to work, because that doesn't get that you need observation with a deductive I mean, I'm sure this is something that you're about to bring up in response to this, but on its own, deduction cannot justify this inference. And unless you have some other premise, like, well, what happened in the past is likely going to happen in the future, or the universe operates according to a principle of uniformity, as he called it, where there are certain laws, and these laws give us reason to make predictions about events that will happen in the future. He said, well, you can't do that deductively. You can't prove a universality principle deductively. It's not something we observe. It's not something that's a priori impossible, that all of a sudden the world will act totally differently, or the universe will operate according to totally different laws, or no laws, just chaos the next day, right? That's clearly a conceivable thing. So a deductive argument, a strictly deductive argument, can't demonstrate it. And any inductive argument to that effect, using probabilities, is just based on it's just a circular reasoning. It's begging the question. It's using induction to justify induction. It's saying, well, induction worked all these times in the past. It's worked great for us. And so now we can expect this method, this really successful method, to continue to work for us until further notice. And to be clear, because this is often a misunderstanding, Hume's point isn't that we can't be certain about what will happen in the future. We can't be certain that these regularities or theories or patterns that we've observed in the past will continue to happen in the future, or continue to operate in the future. His point is, we can't in any way, we don't have any real reason, rational reason, to believe that the world will operate according to some kind of uniformity principle. And so, for the purposes of prediction, any method of which could include astrology, it could include fortune cookies, it could just be me kind of guessing, is just as good rationally as any other. Now, of course, that's not how we act, but that, according to Hume, is just a descriptive fact about us. We operate via custom and habit, and maybe something more ingrained genetically. This is just how we interact with the world, but it's not something we can rationally justify. So go down to the bar, have a few beers, and don't worry about it, because nature has you covered in terms of not sinking into some skeptical, nihilistic despair. But don't think that you can rationally justify it. So that's the view. We tried to lay it out. We tried to look at a few responses to Hume in this episode. And at least I don't think that any of them, including your boy Poppers, is fully satisfying. So, I'm kind of interested, because I'm not an expert in this, and I'm also not wedded to, Popper did not resolve the problem of induction. I'm not wedded to that view. I'd be interested, but any attempts to convince me of that have failed, in my mind, decisively. So I'd like to hear what you guys have to say about it.
Sure, yeah. So we could either just present Popper's critique up front. I think maybe one place to start, though, to sort of ease into it, is to sort of point out that implicit in the problem is this view that there is this principle of induction that we need to rescue. So I think in the episode, you kind of call it like this truth generating feature of the universe. Like, it is a fact that there are these regularities, and these regularities point us towards general laws. And this is what humans are doing. We're observing these regularities in nature, we're making observations, and then we're coming up with these general laws based on observation. And so you pointed out, for instance, like the sun, we view the sun rising every day. And so we see this, and then we come up with a theory that explains it. Or we observe that grass is wet after it rains. We observe that people tend to get better after they take certain medicines. And then we posit general laws that explain these specific phenomenon, these specific repeated phenomenon that we're observing. But I guess I'd start by just pointing out these are actually exceptions to the rule. Like, most of the time, the future does not at all resemble the past. Our ideas change, our technology changes, norms change, society changes. Like, if you our day to day in terms of what we're doing right now looks extremely different than it did 100 years ago. And so it's only in very specific instances that we actually have it's only in very specific realms that the future actually resembles the past. And so this sort of is where Popper and Kant
can I just
before
ask,
him.
Can I just ask you about that specific point? Like, there's so many things that I do every day that are based on my belief that those things will be there. Like, I come up to this studio every day because I have noticed that it's here every day in the past, and have seen. So in one way, you're right that there's not like we're at some global level thinking, this Trump administration will be, the same as the last one, or anything at any kind of level of complexity. But in terms of this idea that that kind of reasoning isn't central to our kind of localized concerns, like that doesn't seem right to me.
Well, let's just take that one example. So every day you get up, you go to University of Houston, you teach, you come home. Yeah.
Well, not every day.
Something like that. And then you say, or one would say, well, that is the future resembling the past because I'm repeating this and I do the same thing and I go back home. But the very notion of it resembling is a function of what you decide counts as a repetition. So if a bird goes on Monday and it doesn't go on Tuesday, you just say, well, that doesn't count. I'm not thinking about that when I'm talking about what it means for something to resemble, right? If there's 3 students and there's 13 students, in one mode, you could say it resembles. In another mode, you could say it doesn't resemble. And so the very notion of something resembling something already has a bias built in because it's you who's deciding what counts as a repetition. There's no repetition in nature. It's what you selectively decide to include and exclude from your accounting, which determines if said thing has repeated or not.
Okay, true. But then there are certain things I could get more specific, right? I expect my key to open my office. I expect that to be my office, and somebody doesn't come in and say, "What are you going to do in my office? What are you doing in my office?" Like, so that I could make the expectations more specific, and then it would be.
So I don't want to step on where Ben was going to go, but
No, this is good. This is good.
I do want to step on where Ben's going to go. And so in your summary and on Wikipedia and in the whole discourse that has started from Hume up until now, I think so much confusion is born from the word justify. So when you say, or when Hume says that it is justified to assume that the future is going to resemble the past, what he means is that there is absolutely no way we'll ever be wrong about this thing ever. Right? Like
that's not what though. That's not no.
So
Just even that there's a high
mean?
probability or that I should expect that over just that not being my office.
The justification he is seeking is compared to deductive inference, right? So deductive inference, he says, is justified when you say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's the justification he wants. He wants the rock solid truth.
But that's just a relation of ideas, like a relation of language, right? Like you're not learning anything new through deduction.
Oh, you absolutely are. No, what do you mean? So if I give you all of Euclid's 5 axioms, say,
but you don't get Euclid's 5 axioms deductively. You have to assume.
Of course, you conjecture them. Yeah, precisely. But then the deductive step is what all mathematicians are working on all of the time. So deduction is non-trivial, and you do get something out of it, precisely because there is a set of infinite possible things that could be concluded from any set of axioms, and most of them are completely trivial and boring. And so the thing that you get doesn't come from deduction. It comes from humans' ingenuity and effort to search through this infinite space of potential things that could be deduced from said axioms. And then you got to find the ones that are relevant.
But again, like I thought that was the point, is that this really isn't about absolute certainty. Nobody is expecting absolute certainty. In fact, this is what Wesley Salmon accuses Popper of doing, is precisely what you're doing, which is saying unnecessarily that induction or our theories can't give us absolute certainty when nobody expected that, and that's not the question, right? Like the question is, why have any reason to prefer this view of what will happen than any other view of what will happen that isn't self-contradictory? That's the question. And the argument and Hume's problem is meant to say we don't have that. Not that we don't have absolute certainty. That would just that we that's so that like that has to be very clear so we're arguing over the same thing.
Yeah, 100%. So when you say justify, you're not talking about absolute certainty. You're just talking about like, why do we think anything? Like, what's the reason? What's the rationale?
Why do we expect, say, science to give us a better prediction, or weather models to give us a better prediction about what the weather will be tomorrow than astrology, or just me like just using my gut and like the fact that my knee is hurting? Like why have any preference for the scientific model over these other ways that are internally coherent of predicting the future? That's the question. That's the problem.
Okay, so maybe let's get Popper's solution on the table here, so that
sorry,
can get mad at it.
That's my fault. That's
and then no. This is great. This is exactly.
I do this shit all the time.
This is exactly what we're here for. So Popper wants to say, in some sense, he wants to agree with you and say you're right in that there's no absolute justification for where our ideas are coming from. So he wants to get rid of like justificationism in this sense, and say, and this is why I have a sense that deep down in your heart, we might be able to convince you to be a Popperian at the end of this, because Popper ties like art and epistemology together in a way that like severe rationalists don't want to do, right? So Popper wants to say, when we come up with ideas and theories about the way the world works to explain any sort of phenomenon, we're conjecturing them just out of our imagination, and there's no justifying where those ideas come from. Once they're ideas out there, then we try and test them as severely as possible. And this is where his famous falsification criteria comes in, right? So he wants to say, now that all these ideas exist, you have a theory, I have a theory, Baden has a theory. Now we're just going to go hard and test the shit out of them until there's sort of one theory left standing. So I guess one issue here is that if you're looking for like an absolute justification about sort of why we can even propose certain theories in the first place, Popper's not going to give that to you, and he sort of dismisses that as a pseudo problem. And I don't think anything can give that to you, right?
Sure, I agree with that. That again, I don't think that's the question or the issue, but I agree with you on that.
Okay, nice. And then once we have various theories in play, so now let's take the pain in your knee, right? So why do you expect there to be pain in your knee tomorrow if you had pain yesterday? Now we have various theories that purport to explain that pain. You know, you have like a tear in your ACL. One person says, and then another person says, well, the stars lined up in some way, and you're not going to have pain because of that. And then now we're in a position where we just want to judge those theories based on the merits of them as theories, right? So we want to treat these as different ideas and see which ones we can falsify, basically, which I'm sure is not going to satisfy you, but...
Well, it just doesn't seem to even try to address the question, right? Like, so I could agree, yeah, sure. Once if I want to explain the pain in my knee or explain any kind of phenomenon, yes, I want to like look at the leading theories and maybe subject them to some severe tests or whatever. But the question isn't, how do I want to best explain for my satisfaction the pain in my knee right now? The question is, how do I make myself think that theory is going to operate as it has in the past tomorrow? That's the question.
It depends on the theory. So let's just take the simple example, like the famous example of like, why do we think the sun's going to rise tomorrow? Well, the theory is heliocentrism and the planet is rotating. And when I say that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, I am implicitly assuming that the sun hasn't blown up, that there's not going to be an asteroid. But that's all just part of the theory. And so what lets us be fairly confident, because I'm glad to hear you say that when you say justify, you're not talking about absolute certainty and that we could always be wrong. Right. So if you acknowledge it,
right. Nobody is, yeah. And nobody argued on that basis that the problem of induction was real also.
Well, historically, that's been the whole search for the inductive rule, right? It's like the comparison is always against
not
deduction.
To be not absolute certainty about its. Well, I guess maybe we're talking about two different things. Not absolute,
certainty in the deductive sense, right? In the same sense that you could, where you are certain about the rules of deductive inference.
Oh, right. Yeah. Nobody thinks that. I mean, part of the whole, understanding of induction, like, it's already built in that can't give you absolute certainty.
So then what do you mean by justify? I don't know what you mean by justify. That just like maybe just explain what you mean by justify if you don't mean absolute
I guess I'm just going to I'm going to have to keep repeating what I've been saying, which is just, I want some reason to go to Space City Weather, our really good weather forecaster in Houston, rather than consult my horoscope to find out what will happen in the future. I'm not looking to explain past behavior or past weather patterns. I am just focused on having some rational basis for preferring one strategy of predicting the future over another. That's what I mean.
But you're also looking for an all-purpose rule that will always allow you to figure it out for every possible predictive domain. Or what I would want to say is, well, let's talk about how meteorology works. It works based on the fact that we know something about weather patterns, we know something about laws of physics, and we have a shit ton of data that allows us to train very huge predictive machine learning models to give us forecasts of about 14 days in advance, and anything beyond that you wouldn't trust, right? So I'll give you an explanation for that, and then I can give you an explanation for another thing, and then give you an explanation for a third thing. But you're not looking for that.
No, you're looking for a reason to think that these theories that may have operated really well up till right now, that they won't just completely be different, and then actually tomorrow it should. Will. I know some of them will, but that's not an answer to the question, right? Like, you still do prefer certain theories about what will happen in the future over others, right? And that implicitly assumes some kind of uniformity principle. And it's from my little reading I was doing, like Popper concedes that the predictive import of what he's talking about is minimal or completely absent. But that's what we're talking about, the predictive import of your theories.
Yeah, I mean, I read Wesley Salmon, and he did not accurately summarize Popper, but we can talk about that later on. But yeah,
sure. I guess I trust you more, but because since you seem like more of an expert, but also you seem
more of a dogmatist.
Yeah.
Yeah,
this is a little bit of a cult I'm sensing. the Popperian, also from our Reddit, from some people on our Reddit page right now.
Well, the cult is defined simply by people who've read Popper and then people who've read writing about Popper, and that's where the cult is formed.
I have, to be fair,
definitionally people who have read it, understood it, and then get so annoyed by all of the writing about him that doesn't accurately summarize his views. And so that defines the nature of the cult.
Yes. Got it. Well, for the record, I have read Popper. I read, whatever the thing was on induction, probably not all of, conjectures and refutations, but then also The Open Society and His Enemies I've read multiple times. A little bit on a different issue, but, he takes the same spirit to that. And and if you have disagreements over people's interpretation of Popper, I have serious disagreements that I am wedded to about his interpretation of Plato, which I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that would be a fun second conversation. Yeah, that would be really interesting because I would love to hear your views on that. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Okay. Let me try and be the reasonable middle ground here between you two. So, Kayla, I just want to tackle your question directly, right? So we have this, we have the weather question, right? And you're wondering, why trust our weather models over astrology for the weather next Tuesday? Okay. I think to understand where Popper's coming from, you have to realize he doesn't view prediction as the primary aim of theories. He views them as just wanting to explain reality, right? So if you look at theories in terms of just positing a structure of the world, what do they say about the world? We have theories of weather that are coherent with our best understanding of the laws of physics, planets, rotation of the Earth, et cetera, right? And importantly, these theories have been subjected to many previous tests, right? So that's where the history comes in. Whereas astrology posits a structure of the world that has failed basically every scientific test we can throw at it, right? It has no explanatory power. And so the why you should trust the weather models over astrology is simply that, because in terms of just explaining the world, our theories about the weather do a much better job than our theories of astrology.
And just one thing to add, one way to say it is, astrology has no explanatory power, or you could say it has infinite explanatory power, because no matter what happens, you could come up with some astrological justification for it. Right. It's the same critique of Freud and Marxism and stuff. You could always see some way to explain it. Thus, it's discardable for that reason, that no matter what occurs, you could come up with some explanation under this framework that will always fit the data. Compared to heliocentrism, what we know about cloud formation and H2O and what happens when you have sunlight coming into a planet with an atmosphere, et cetera, that you can't just change all the variables. You can't just fiddle with it so that no matter what happens, you get what you want. And that is a hugely decisive critique and a way to adjudicate between shitty theories that can just be switched around, swapped around whenever you need to, compared to ones that are kind of locked snugly and tightly fit to reality and what we see.
So, okay, a couple things on that. Again, I think I would challenge you on this question, and maybe this is just me being not reading Popper well enough, or reading too many people who write about him. But it does seem like the severe test is a hallmark of a good theory, a theory we can trust, a strong theory that has been rigorously attempted to be falsified, right? Like that is one of the criteria that we're supposed to be using. And a severe test is a prediction, number one. So it's not that he doesn't think prediction plays a role in how we adjudicate between good theories. But I guess even if I just set that as, so if you concede that, then that's not an issue. Then the question is, okay, as a theory of explaining the weather in the past, I like your theory better because of all the different Popperian virtues that theory has. But why think that's going to apply to the future? If you say, well, because this is done so well in the past, we should expect it to also continue.
That isn't what we're saying, to be clear.
Right. I imagine it's not, but then what are you saying? Like, I feel like here's where this starts to sound a little pragmatic or some other kind of epistemology than the kind of scientific realist epistemology that I think Popper wanted to claim he subscribed to.
This is great. So maybe let's just sharpen up the example with something like putting weather aside because it's a bit complicated. Let's just take the example of gravity, right? So you things fall. If you hold up your glass now, it's going to fall onto the table and shatter. And you say, well, why do I prefer a theory that happens next Tuesday as opposed to one where I let go of the glass and it floats? Like what reason do I have to prefer the gravity theory versus the upside down gravity theory? And it's because if you take the upside down gravity theory seriously as a theory, right? So like, let's actually take that seriously. Like what view does that theory now have of the world? It now leaves open so many questions that you need to explain. Like, how is it that gravity has all of a sudden reversed and it was, constant in this space-time location up till now and now totally changes, right? So now you have way more things to explain. Yeah, so it's that, right? So it's taking all these ideas seriously as theories and just saying, okay, if that was true, then what would that theory say about the world? And you need to posit all these unexplained phenomenon for that theory to be true.
So is it like an Occam's razor view? Is it because so the way this criticism goes, it's like I can come up with so many different theories that haven't been falsified that could account for all of a sudden things floating up when they and the laws of gravity being reversed or whatever. Like so you're familiar with that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So one misconception about Popper's work is that he thinks that falsification is like the most important thing, and he doesn't. He thinks that falsification and prediction is something you do very rarely, frankly, because his core part of his epistemology is not about falsification; it's about criticism. And so when you talk about the crucial test, when you talk about the severe test, when you talk about having two theories, both of which make predictions which differ, and the outcome of the prediction will determine if theory A is correct or theory B is correct. That is like so rare in the whole lifetime of a scientist, because what happens well before that stage is just criticism. So you have 100,000 different theories, and you think, okay, well, one theory says that on Tuesday, the whole rules of gravity will just invert, but it could be Wednesday, it could be Friday, it could be next month. And so it's not just Occam's razor. One mode of criticism is simplicity. Are you adding a bunch of surplus assumptions that are unnecessary? Another mode of criticism is it internally contradictory? Another mode is, does it make sense? Like, are there things defined? Do we know what we're talking about? Another mode is, does it cohere with everything else we take to be true? We assume temporarily to be true. And so the falsification thing, the prediction thing, is an important part of science, but it is not nearly as important as the criticism stage. That happens internally, that happens intersubjectively, that happens when you submit things to peer review. And that's where we can start filtering out the shitty theories. So it's not just Occam's razor, it's the whole space of every possible kind of critique that anyone can make. And that's how we go from a functionally infinite set of possible theories about the inversion of Newton's gravity to Einstein, because only one of them actually withstands all criticisms that have been thrown at it, including experimental ones.
I think Tamler's going to say why prefer those theories over other ones. If my prediction is correct.
I was actually going to say, like, I always wonder when Popperians start talking about what we do, to what extent, like, what exactly you mean by that? Because certain scientists make predictions all the time, and, you know, the whole null hypothesis testing is built around falsifying the null, right? And so, I mean, okay, maybe let's set that aside. That's probably a different issue. So like when you say that, do you mean at some kind of deep level that would be inaccessible or not transparent to the people who are doing it? Or do you mean that like you interview scientists of all different kinds as to what they're doing and the role prediction plays in it and the role falsification plays in it, and they will say not very much?
Even easier than that. You forgot your keys. You don't know where the keys are in your house. Yeah. So now you theorize a couple different theories about where it is. Maybe it's in your bedroom. Maybe it's in your car. Maybe your dog ate it. Maybe it's floated to the roof because the laws of gravity have inverted in that particular bedroom. For each of these, you don't run frickin' falsifiable tests. You quickly say, okay, well, actually, I wasn't in my car for the last 3 weeks, so that one's out. That's an internal criticism. You get rid of that idea. Then you think, well, actually, okay, I was in my bedroom. I'm going to go check there because of the various things that you've just thought about. That one, you can't find a immediately wrong thing about it. And so you go and you check. And that is a falsificatory kind of experiment. This is what you do when you're fixing your toilet, when you are trying to figure out why your roof is leaking. You come up with 1,000 ideas. Most of them don't even exit your lips because internally you've quickly figured out what's wrong with that, right? And then you just discard it. And that's what I'm talking about. So that process from you lost your keys all the way up to, holy shit, we have a competing theory of Newton's gravity and we need to get Arthur Eddington on that frickin' boat and we need to go look at that starlight. That's all the same process. It's unified from the mundane to the cosmological.
Okay. All right. I might come back to that because I'm still a little confused as to like what the basis of you saying that this is what we're doing.
Just think about how you find your keys. Just tell me how you find your keys.
But how I find my keys might not be the same as like how scientists understand what it is that they're doing.
The same. And it's thinking of ideas and getting rid of the ones that don't work.
But you're just saying that, like you're not. I could say that's not how it is. You know, like we can all say whatever we want. The point is, like, why am I? But I guess the second question is what that. Yeah, I guess the question is, given that this is based on the future, and why should I expect theories that have been well tested, however you want to say that, in the past, will be more likely to give me information about the future? And I think, like Ben was saying earlier, well, you would have to do all this other work in terms of trying to get a good theory that would say, well, all of a sudden your office will be upside down when you go there the next day, or bourbon will taste like apple juice. Like, and that actually makes sense to me. It's like, what, but you know, I think I might be getting this. So this combines what you were just saying with what Ben was just saying. So is the idea that it's not that yes, there's plenty of other theories that haven't been falsified about what my bourbon will taste like in the, like tomorrow. But there is a good fleshed out theory about why I think it'll taste more or less like what it tastes today. And if I want to come up with another theory that says something else, I would have to do I would have to subject that to a lot of internal criticism to see why that, okay. I think I have that. And if I can't do that, then I will discard that theory internally. If I'm being honest with myself, I won't expect it. I will operate with the theory that I currently have about how my bourbon is going to taste.
Exactly.
Yeah. So relying on the predictions of a theory is a second order effect of just wanting theories that explain more of reality. So if we just sit down and we say, what do we want out of good theories? We'll probably converge on something like, we want it to posit a specific structure of the world and then we can argue about whether that structure is true. We want things that explain more phenomenon rather than less phenomenon. Great. And then we can talk about the predictive consequences of those theories. But we don't start by just asking, can we trust the predictions of a theory? Right? First, we just talk about theories, qua theories, and then we talk about their predictive power.
Nice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's so many domains where our quote best theory says that you can't predict things and there's no regularities there. So chaos theory and complexity theory and human society, or even the weather 6 months from now. That's why we don't have 6-month forecasts, right? So it's not like we just assume that in every place there will be a regularity and we can make a prediction. That's the special case. That's not the pure case. Most of the time, the assumption is we can't predict the future. Occasionally, we can. If it's like Halley's Comet and we know that Halley's Comet's going to come around every 76 years, precisely because we're assuming that there's not going to be some freaking meteorite that knocks it out of its path. But all of this ultimately comes down to the decision, is the assumption that this theory is true more reasonable or less reasonable than the assumption that this theory isn't true? And you just have to make that judgment call. And that's all we can do. There's no universal principle that will always tell us you can expect regularities to persist. And that's why when we talk about weather patterns, there's going to be a totally different explanation as to why we can predict the weather than it would be if we're predicting if you're going to go to work tomorrow. It's just a different thing.
Okay, so then I think the dialectical move now at this point for someone is to say, well, look, we're intuitive scientists. Like, we kind of think like this. We kind of operate according to those principles. I'm not an astrologer. I'm not a deeply religious person. But somebody who was, right, and who did have strong beliefs that we would consider irrational, and that those beliefs say about, I don't know, a future apocalypse or the second coming or something like that, they consider, according to their criteria, holds up to just as much scrutiny, a lot more explanatory power in their view, in terms of some deep metaphysical questions, right? And so what allows Popper and this cult of Popperians to say, well, this is, our criteria are the right criteria when it comes to predicting future events, or selecting theories that offer some probability about what will happen in the future.
The ease with which the details of the explanation can be changed arbitrarily to explain any given phenomena. So the theory of why the sun rises, which involves a spherical Earth orbiting a sun that rotates every 24 hours. Each detail there, if you change it even a little bit, it destroys entirely the explanation and everything that you could predict from that explanation. If you're talking about the sun rising because the sun god Ra tells it it's going to rise, then you could just switch out any detail. So why is it Ra? Why is it the sun? Why doesn't he say in the third month of December 2600 that it's going to change? Because all the details are just variable, right? And so that's the major objective criterion with which we can start to do away with the subjective nature of people preferring one belief over the other belief.
Wait, I'm confused about that. So you can ask more questions about the Ra belief or some kind of theistic belief, like why didn't God choose to do it this way? But you can do that about, like, why aren't the laws different? Why aren't the laws of gravitary motion different? You can do that for anything.
Well, you can't change.
They can say just necessarily the same. Like, it's a benevolent God. They're not going to suddenly switch everything up in 3400, but they will switch everything up in 3822 when will all be engulfed in flames or whatever.
Mhm. Well, you can't just say, you know what, to make this theory of gravity work, I'm going to change the gravitational, or the speed with which a ball falls in frictionless environments on the surface of the Earth to 9.87 meters per second. Say, you're not free to choose the value of that variable, right? That variable is locked based on experiment and based on what we know about the world. But why that number? Well, it's measured by experiment. Einstein's theory is better. Einstein's theory tells you why it should be that number, and that's what makes Einstein's theory even more hard to vary, because you introduce more variables, you introduce more knobs you can tune, and all of them have to be set exactly right, because if you change it even a little bit, it breaks the entire freaking thing. So it's not like you can just necessarily sort all explanations into that which you can vary and that which you can't, but it does give you some objective criterion, and that's why we get rid of astrology, and that's why we get rid of homeopathy, right? Because you can just always come up with some patch to the theory to explain whatever the hell it is that you want to explain. But you can't do that with Einstein's theory of gravity. You can't do that with Newton, and that's what makes it locked in place, right? That's the major difference.
You certainly can do it with almost any psychology theory or
Which is,
social science.
It's a good,
theory,
which is a great point.
Yeah.
Which is a really good point, and that's why the softer the science, typically the more variable the theories are. Hence the fact that there's less credence in them. There's less reason to think that they're actually true, and then the harder the science, the more locked in it is. But like, as people who are scientifically inclined, internally we try to do this when we're writing and stuff, right? We try to make up an explanation that you can't just wiggle around all the parts, and it's hard depending on the thing that you're trying to explain. But that's just what good writing and good thinking is, right? You want your argument to be as snug as possible. No.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I'm not going to be the best avatar for somebody because it does kind of accurately describe, for the most part, I think, the way I go about, coming up with my own personal theories for what happens. But somebody who really did have, sophisticated, say, theistic beliefs, or even a sophisticated kind of astrology or something that invoked tarot cards or I Ching or the I Ching or something like that, I think could, I guess, one of two things. One, come up with a theory that is also somewhat immune to that kind of variability you're talking about. But also, number two, just say, well, you seem to fetishize variability as some kind of like supreme virtue that makes it rational to value a theory with that criterion. But like, that's not, that doesn't make it so, just because you say that's, So I don't know. What would you say to both of those? Because I know both of those kinds of objections have been made to Popper.
Yeah, good. Okay. So what you're pointing out is that, like, for any specific set of criteria I give you, I can always step back and say, why those criteria, right? And I think there are a couple answers. One is that, we have to choose something, just as in logic, when we're talking about deduction, we that's still a formal system. That didn't pop out. It's not imbued in the physics of the world and just, happened to be in our brains. We had to like conjecture that system of logic. So you always make, a first step. And then the question is, what is the most reasonable first step to make? And that's just another theory about the world. And so now we can just look at criteria, what sort of criteria we should use to evaluate theories as itself a theory, right? And so one of these theories says, okay, we should use the criteria of like consistency, being able to be falsified, like importantly, sort of making these risky predictions, positing a strict structure of the world, versus a set of criteria that don't have any of those, that are like sort of privilege, experience or subjective experience in some sort of ad hoc way, don't tell you how to evaluate.
Is this something you've arrived at after, 10 years of intensive meditation? You could come up with a lot of ones that don't sound completely crazy or crackpot, right?
Yeah, and you could come up with a lot of ones that are wrong. And so the question is, do we prefer consistent theories that try and explain a lot about the world and risk being wrong or not? And we have to choose one of those sets of criteria by which to evaluate theories.
But then they would say, I agree, and I choose the one that allows the I Ching to actually have as much predictive import, even though your theories say that it wouldn't.
And they are free to say that. And then those of us who think that they're barking up the wrong tree are free to just not listen to them, right? Like it's
like consensus is not required, I guess.
Yeah, and it's kind of equivalent to saying, like, what is stopping people from saying, well, I want to do math that doesn't have deductive. This is not deductive. I just want to assert something, and then I want to just say something else. And why do you need this like deductive proof property of mathematics? Like, what's forcing me to do that? And the answer is something like, well, you're not forced to do it. You can do whatever you want, but if you're not doing that, then you aren't doing mathematics, because mathematics is defined by a community of people who all agree that this property is required to do this thing. So you're free to do whatever you want. If you want to have a cosmological theory that uses the sun, ra, God, go nuts. See how much medicine you can make out of that theory. And so there's no way to say that they can't do it. But
well, not that they can't do it, like they'll be thrown into prison if they do it. But it seems like if you're a scientific realist, you think actually they can go do that, but they're going to be wrong about the world, and I will be right about the world. And that to make that claim, you think, well, my way of deciding on criteria for theory selection is better than their way of deciding on criteria for theory selection, right? And I guess, look, we could be splitting hairs at this point. It could be what I think is slightly like a form of pragmatism. You think it's a form of realism, but I guess the question is, it does seem like science has aspirations to not just be like, oh yeah, you guys do your thing and see what you find out about the world, and we'll do ours. And no way to know which one. It's just kind of a matter of personal history and psychology that we've each decided on our way of approaching acquiring knowledge, and it's specifically knowledge about the future.
Yeah, well, so let's talk about the pragmatism thing. So pragmatism says that what's true is what's useful. There's no such thing as truth or reality. Is just what is useful. If you want to correct that or amend that, I take
yeah, I mean, that's a pretty simplistic but it boils down to some version of that.
Recognizing there's all sorts of shades of nuance, but if you temporarily allow me to go with that course definition. So I'm not saying that at all, nor is Ben, nor is Popper, but there is a related claim, which is that if you have the truth, that also will be freaking useful. And why this is relevant is that you have to start with some assumptions. The one assumption is that the world is logically consistent. There is a real world to be discovered. And when we have an explanation for a phenomena, that will be hard to change for the exact reason that the world doesn't just change arbitrarily. That's just an assumption. Then we start building upon that assumption. And then we start finding that, holy heck, the more we build on that, the more stuff we get. And the use of that assumption starts to give us some belief in its truth. So I'm not saying that truth equals usefulness, but I am saying that usefulness over time can start to split the difference between just thinking that it's a 50-50 coin flip. That if it's really useful, if it's true, then it will be useful. And we start seeing useful stuff. So now we can believe more strongly that the assumption that it is true is more reasonable than the assumption that it's not true. That's how I relate the truth and usefulness to this specific question without flipping into pragmatism or anti-realism.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to bring back the questions of induction, but or the problem of induction, but also, I guess the debate isn't between theories. The debate is in criteria that will determine the best kind of theory.
Those are theories, though. Those are still theories, right?
Sure. But okay, so fine. So then I guess the question is why, even if that's a theory, choose that theory. You can't say, oh, because it has these Popperian qualities, that's why we should choose that way of. That's completely begging the question, right?
Well, no, that's what the usefulness comments are about.
But then if it's the usefulness thing, then it just sounds pragmatist. And I know you're saying, no, it's because true things lead to but really, you never find out the truth. You just find out what's useful, right? You just true things lead to pragmatic use. Okay, but how do we know what the true thing is? And
we can never know it with certainty.
That's not the issue.
No, we just have to assume. We just have to assume. I'm just saying we have to assume. We have to start with the assumption. So I'm just saying
that's the most annoying of the Popperian habits, I think. Nice. To let you know, which idea that people are demanding certainty when people aren't. It's just such a easy way to dodge. But this is what
you were saying. How can you be certain that the assumptions underlying what we've said are better?
I didn't ask how you can be certain. I was like, why have any reason to think that it's better? Is the idea. I never used the word certainty except to say that it's not about that.
Fair. I'll stop putting words in your mouth. Fair point.
That clip is going at the beginning of the episode, by the way.
I wonder, I don't know if that's true, by the way.
That was awesome.
I could maybe have used it and you got me, and that's a big gotcha moment. But if I have, I misspoke.
I'm taking that not from the use of the word certainty, but from the whole 100-year search for justification. I equate justification with certainty in that sense. So to the extent that we're talking about, give me some universal principle of induction that would allow me to justify why I think the future is going to resemble the past. That to me is equivalent to how can we be certain that the future is going to resemble the past? We can talk about probability. That's going to get us into a thorny other thing.
No.
I just
but
don't
that's
know what you mean by justify if you don't mean.
Here's how I mean justify. If I want to decide whether to bet on the Patriots next week, right? I want to have some kind of justifiable basis if I'm going to bet my hard-earned money on that team.
Justify to define justify.
Yeah, of course, right? So I want to have some basis, for deciding whether, a reason to decide whether to bet on them or not. Somebody gives me all these stats and trends and theories of a kind as to why, based on what's happened to them last week, based on public perception. That gives, and they say, this leads me to believe that the spread, I don't even know if they're they might have a bye next week, but let's say they're playing someone and the spread is 6.5. That's 2 points too high. I think the spread, so it's a good bet to actually, they'd be getting 6.5. There's no team they would be favored by 6.5. So they would be that's a good reason to take the Ravens. Then, that's justified to me. Okay, so I have some reason beyond just my own intuition to bet on the Ravens rather than to not, or to bet on the against the Patriots rather than to bet for the Patriots. It's not certainty. Of course, I'm not going to get certainty about that. None of these things work with certainty. Same with poker, right? You're not looking for certainty, but you are talking. It's very easy to talk about whether you're justified to, check raise someone with your hand without talking about whether you're certain that that's the right move in any given situation. It's all about probabilities.
But all the moves you just made to say why you prefer this theory about who you should bet on, right? Because it's consistent with this observed behavior in the world that posits a mechanism by which the team is going to win. All this stuff. I mean, sports betting, just as a side, is I don't love the example for this purpose, because most of the time I would say it's sports betting is it's almost by definition unjustifiable in this sense, but all these reasons that you're privileging.
But poker betting isn't, right? Poker betting. So if you don't like sports betting, poker is a pretty clear-cut case of whether you talk about justified ways of playing a hand versus unjustified without ever thinking oh, you're certain about the strategy at a meta level, or the way any particular hand will turn out at the local level.
Yeah, agreed. But there, you're still bundling in tons of assumptions about the logic of the game, how the game is going to proceed, that the game is going to proceed, that other people are behaving in certain ways, that they're not cheating, etc. So you're never getting out from this situation where you're making a bunch of assumptions, and the assumptions you're making there to want to be justified are much weaker than the assumptions that you should prefer theories of the world that explain more rather than explain less and are consistent, and this sort of stuff. And so, like, if we're getting to a place where you want to say, you can always, I guess the issue is you can always ask the question, why that, right? You can always say, why prefer that set of criteria over this set of criteria? And so we can never give you an answer if you keep asking that question. You have to take one set of theories over the other at some point.
And we already have
Sure.
given a bunch of answers which I think scratch that itch, right? So why are we justified in astronomy over astrology? Well, we talked about the easiness to vary certain explanations. We talked about it cohering with other things we know. We talk about how the astrology theory is like a set of functionally infinite number of different theories. These are all, quote, justifications that allow you to assume one is more reasonable than the other one. But at the end of the day, you always will have to make an assuming step, which is I have two things, and I'm just going to say, I'm going to assume this one's true and start building on that. But if that's all you need for justification, then you have that already. The problem of induction doesn't give you anything else that you don't already have.
I guess the original question was how, like, I don't understand justification without certainty. So that's what I was giving an example of, justification without certainty. And that is what people are looking for when they're trying to decide between competing claims and competing methods of how to determine what will happen in the future. It isn't about, you can't be absolutely certain that the scientific one is the better one, because of course you can't, right? You can't, and it might be that a form of astrology that we don't know is actually right and can explain
sure.
all the Popperian, like, and you all agree with that, right? You're like, so that's, that's the original question, though. I don't even remember what we were talking about before we got sidetracked by the certainty thing. But
well, yes. So I asked what you meant by justification. If you didn't mean being certain, and then you used poker and sports betting as a great example. To which you then,
well, a bad example, sports betting, apparently.
Yeah.
Or vexed example, maybe. Yeah.
So then I was like, okay, so what do you mean by justify here? You mean, well, why do I have any reasons to assume this thing compared to this other thing?
Yeah. Especially if, like, I am the person that actually does, right? Or I'm officially neutral between the two. Let's say you're neutral between some form of, like a rigorous meditation approach to get at kind of deep insights about the nature of reality versus a more scientific one. And I'm sure that that somebody who is advocating for the meditative approach will have a whole different set of criteria, and maybe some of them will also include ethical considerations, but a whole different set of criteria about what constitutes a good theory about certain basic metaphysical facts of the universe. And the question is, why go? I think those theories are pretty fleshed out. They are, if you the more you dig into it, the more you might find that certain assumptions are quite invariable. And even if they're not as invariable, they might say, well, that doesn't mean as much to me, the variableness or the local predictive power or the explanatory virtues of it. Like, well, our thing explains different aspects of life than the scientific method explains. Like, I don't know, like, it does seem like the thing you might be looking for there is, well, I should go with more strictly science-based approach versus the more meditative approach to try to inquire using those methods about the nature of reality. And maybe you would say you don't need to like have an answer to that question, which is probably true. Like you're going to go with one or you're going to go with the other one. And that'll probably depend a lot on you and your, and but yeah, or maybe you won't. Maybe you'll say, no, we have clear reason to reject some kind of meditation insight practice over a more physics-based approach.
Well, let me just flip the question back to you. So you have you're a poker player and you like to bet on sports games, and you have some rationale in order to do so. And then I say, okay, well, I'm going to make bets based on looking at the tea leaves between every poker hand. The fact that I'm doing that, does that cast doubt onto your strategy? Does that make you think like, oh shit, maybe everything that I think is an accurate way to make predictions is like wrong because of the existence of somebody else doing it completely differently? Because that's kind of what you're saying to us, right? Like,
no,
given a bunch of criteria.
Let's say I'm uncertain whether somebody else's poker strategy is actually better than my poker strategy, and I'm trying to figure out like which one I should adopt. Like I'm not saying that just because people like for thousands of years have adopted insight practice as a way of discovering certain fundamental facts about the universe and our place in it and how to I'm saying like that this is a really fleshed out approach, and it probably has defects in certain Popperian virtues compared to a more scientific approach. But I, as someone who's not wedded to either and not part of this cult, why am I supposed to think, oh, I should reject meditation as insight over this? Well, and I know I'm free to do that, and I know
no. I don't reject meditation as insight. I think meditation is given a lot of insight. It just depends on what it is that you're trying to explain. So we reject meditation as giving us insight into the center of stars, absolutely. But we don't reject meditation as giving us insight into the properties of our own mind, all the Sam Harris
the nature of consciousness or something like that.
So there's nothing about the scientific approach that rejects meditation. I'm pro meditation. Meditation is great. It just depends on what reasons we have to think that this methodology will give us insight into this specific question. And if we don't have a good reason to believe so, then we reject it. But if we do, then we don't reject it. And there's nothing anti-scientific about recognizing that you can have absolute important insights coming from the contemplative tradition. It's just that it depends on what it is that is asked to be explained. And then why do we think that this approach is going to be better or worse than some other approach? But it's none of us are dogmatically saying you can't use meditation to learn stuff. We're just trying to be realistic about where that domain applies and what questions are amenable to that approach.
Okay. I mean, I can't tell. Like, I actually feel like
okay I've ever heard of my life.
Yeah.
It just sometimes, I have a ton of sympathy, and like I said, like I'm partly playing devil's advocate, although there are a few issues where I feel like the Popperian is dodging the question at issue, or dismissing it, or saying you can't ask that question, or saying but whatever.
Maybe we should go into those. Maybe we should go into those. What?
No, I think I've already highlighted the places where I think that happens, and I actually did learn, and I really like this idea of, well, if you want to believe that, like, what's your theory to explain that? And I do think in a lot of cases it would break down, and so you would go back to the normal kind of scientific way of doing it. If you tried to offer some kind of alternate, fleshed out theory to explain, well, why you think bourbon will taste like orange juice starting a week from Tuesday, right? You would eventually, it would be, arbitrary, just by your own lights, you would find that theory to be unconvincing. And that's like, I think that's a really good answer. I think when it comes to some more like the deeper kinds of disagreements where the demarcation principle, between science and non-science or science and pseudoscience, where you do have fleshed out alternative approaches that aren't just me thinking, well, I could say this or I could say that, but they're actually really well thought out approaches to trying to understand truth and trying to understand the world. Like there, it's going to be harder to say, oh, well, your theory will break down without begging the question and saying, well, no, your theory doesn't break down. It just doesn't, it lacks these Popperian virtues. And we should always choose theories and approaches that have these Popperian virtues. And that's begging the question. So that's where I think, the issue gets, I guess, dodged, because the question isn't, which theories have the best Popperian virtues, or even which kind of epistemologies have the best Popperian virtues. It's just like, it's which have the ones that should guide my action or understanding.
One detail there. So if some Buddhist meditator in a cave somewhere comes up with some new way to understand the mind, and it works and everyone understands what they're trying to say, and it gives us some insight and some truth, that then becomes a Popperian virtue. The Popperianism expands to include any methodology which gives us insight into the world. Like there's not a clearly delineated, like, you got to do it the Popperian way. Yeah.
Their reports of, and this is, I think, true, that their reports of the truth are going to be not sanctioned by science, because they have no way of demonstrating that without, let's say, although I don't think this is true of many traditions, a lot of traditions think you can have spontaneous enlightenment, but let's just say this particular Buddhist thinks, well, you're not going to understand it. And there's no way. This is prior to concepts, right? Concepts are the problem. Our practice is getting us to go beyond concepts. And so obviously I can't articulate it to you and I can't explain it to you. Still less can I explain it to you in a way that, exhibits the kind of virtues where you think we should even take it seriously. But this is the way. This is the path. And the only way you're going to understand that is if you do it, if you adopt my approach instead of this rigid Popperian approach. Well, I withdraw rigid. Yeah.
Just one tiny little detail, which is, I think that many people listening to this podcast and listening to your podcast who've never read Popper would reject this guy who claims to know everything but can't explain it to you. So it's nothing necessarily Popperian about ruling that out. It's just, you just have to be skeptical and not be
but I would
by bullshit artists.
I don't think he's a bullshit artist. Like, I think that's totally possible that you might need to engage in some kind of daily practice to understand certain deep things. Like, so I don't reject this guy and what he's saying at all. Like, even if some people would. Yeah.
Okay. So one thing to point out here, that I can't quite tell if you're going there, but it relates to something I said at the beginning. It's just that Popper is introduced this like demarcation between science and metaphysics, not as demarcation between like meaning and non-meaning, or like sense and nonsense, right? So Popper has tons of sympathy for these kind of theories that they're not quite fleshed out enough, right? Where someone says, I think there's something going on with the subconscious and consciousness, and like, I don't know what it is. And Popper wants that person to really like work on that theory. He wants, society to like take that person seriously. He's not saying make fun of this person and throw their ideas in the bin, right? He's quite careful. He wants to cultivate like new ideas. He's just saying we can't quite consider it science. It's not in the same realm as something like Einstein's theory of relativity.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's useless or meaningless, right? Like it just means we should work on it to try and carve out exactly what it's actually saying about the world and consciousness and the universe. So that now we can try and figure out if it's true, right? Like try and make it as scientific as possible. And so, like art, movies, all these things, they're not meaningless in Popper's conception. So it's not this sort of like dogmatic, only science is meaningful, throw out all the non-scientists because they're talking about all this meaningless stuff. I wasn't quite sure if you were getting at that, but I think maybe some of your answer was tinged with that. And I just wanted to make sure that,
no, I didn't mean to imply that Popper was doing that, although, part of the issue with many of these traditions is there's no way in principle that scientific approaches could deem them true because they are experiential, fundamentally experiential, and don't involve concepts. And so even just the demand for a theory would require it would make it impossible to convey the truth of these insights or discovery. I mean, that's how this stuff works, and that's what makes it not science, because in that sense, it's unfalsifiable.
Isn't this what someone like Robert Wright or Sam Harris, isn't this sort of what their project is all about, is bringing these sort of insights into the realm of science, so to speak?
Well, actually, so I can't speak for, I think it is probably Robert Wright's, and there's certainly a whole industry, and it's a sham of people trying to study the brain and meditation, or try, all the kind of empirical
MRI
approach.
stuff,
All of that stuff to is seriously fraudulent, and that's not the fault of the traditions that they're studying. It's the fault of, I think, making big category mistakes about what it is that they're studying. And it's a shame, in my view, because I find value in some of these approaches, that they've wedded themselves to just bad science in a lot of cases. And there is a lot of backlash to doing that. So I'm not saying that Popper's condemning it or saying it's useless, but what I am saying is it is the nature of these traditions that they're not going to be scientifically investigatable in the normal way we do science. So, and then the question is, well, could they still be giving us some kind of deep truth that is different from the truth that science, and maybe even at some level contradictory to what science tells us? And if you want the answer to that question, right? It doesn't seem to me like you can get one without just choosing one or the other and hoping that that's the one. And that could be a live question, a live option. I think it could be for me, honestly, as a latecomer.
So I'm curious, do you think of Sam Harris's Waking Up app as scientific? Because I certainly do.
I mean, I don't know, I don't think of it as scientific or non-scientific, but I think of the practices, some of the practices and some of the non-dual theory that gets talked about is, I take it to be, it's non-scientific, and some of it is. But, Sam Harris himself doesn't think that research is good. The research on the scientific research on meditation, he's pretty skeptical of a lot of that stuff too, but probably does think that for this to be something we take seriously about it, because he's kind of a naive realist, I think, and so I think he would probably agree with some version of what you're saying, but that doesn't make the traditions and the practices scientific, even if Sam Harris's Waking Up app, which I actually give it credit for not leaning too far into that aspect of himself in the app.
I just want to highlight maybe a difference in the way that I use the word science compared to you. And I'll roughly speak for Popper on this, but listeners can fact check me. If by scientific
they
you
can
mean,
falsify you.
Yeah. Touche. If by scientific you mean really people into an MRI machine and then publishing papers on it, then yeah, it's not institutionalized science in that sense. But it is scientific in the sense that Sam Harris is saying, okay, if you try this thing and you do it for long enough, you will expect to see this result. And the result is non-dual awareness. You'll have the sense of self disappearing. You'll recognize that your internal monologue you have a very difficult time controlling. You'll start to see benefits in your interpersonal relationships. You'll be able to focus on your daughter, et cetera, et cetera. Choose the beliefs, choose the claims that you agree with for the purpose of
Right,
my
but I want to
statement here.
separate you'll have lower blood pressure or you'll relate to your daughter better from you will have some understanding of like the fundamental nature of consciousness and the interconnectedness of like that's and whenever you try to talk about that, you're always saying, and anytime they do talk about that, they're always saying, this is not something I can describe. That's the whole point. So you couldn't make by its very nature, you couldn't make an articulatable prediction about what will happen the way you could in a simple way of saying, your blood pressure is going to go down, or you're going to feel less stressed.
You absolutely can make a prediction here. It's very easy. You give 100,000 people Sam Harris's app. You ask them to use it for 6 months. And then at the end, you run a survey. And the survey is, did you reach non-dual awareness? Then you compare the results of that survey to a survey of people who haven't used the app.
Tamler's going to lose his mind with this example.
No, I know. But this is how we get some insight into objective properties of subjective experience. And surveys are imperfect, but it is not anti-scientific to use a survey to ask people, for example, how many times have you thought about committing suicide in the last week? This is an imperfect measurement of a real objective phenomena.
Right, but it's not what I'm talking about. You could do that survey, but it wouldn't get at, like, what is non-dual awareness? Like, and what happens if you have, like, people say yes? You don't even know if what they're reporting or what any of them are reporting is the same thing. Like I don't think that just wouldn't give you any of the kind of information that is the thing that I'm talking about.
Like, and it's a prediction. It's a prediction that can be made, right? It's a prediction that can be made. That could be like
people will say like they achieved long non-dual awareness. Like that's a trivial prediction. Like, of course, some people are going to say it. Who cares?
If 100,000 people, you run that experiment and the treatment effect and the non-treatment effect both report the exact same average amount of achieving non-dual awareness.
What's the non-treatment effect? The people who didn't meditate?
Yeah, exactly. And you just ask them,
So you just ask a random person on the street, did you achieve non-dual awareness in the last?
No, you run an RCT. You take 100,000 people, choose a big number, and then you say in 6 months, I'm going to ask you a set of questions.
Ben, can you help me out
100,000. This is completely reasonable. Sorry, Ben.
It's not reasonable as an answer to my question. It's like, yes, of course you could do this, but you wouldn't. The whole point of it is non-dual awareness. Just that concept is something that isn't.
It wouldn't tell you
that you're not able to articulate by its nature, right?
It wouldn't tell you what it feels like, but it would give you evidence to support the claim that there is something to learn and that
we already have that evidence. So many people who have engaged in these practices report achieving non-dual awareness, right? Like, so that's already done. Don't save your money, save your MTurk credits.
But this is evidence to my point that you can use the scientific method on the meditative contemplative state. That's all I'm saying. Is if you say you already have that evidence, then you've already moved the claim that it's scientific or that's not scientific into the purview of science. And that's all I'm trying to do.
But Vaden, you're just talking about the question of like whether something has happened, not like actually sculpting out what exactly has happened. Like I think Tamler's trying to get at what, trying to scientifically describe exactly what this experience is like. And you're talking about, predictive consequences of having these kind of.
I'm saying we can use the tools of science on this question. I'm not saying that we can necessarily understand everything about it.
You can, right? But my point is, you can't understand. Yeah, of course you can. Like, you can't understand the central aspect of it using science. This is
exactly what Tamler's saying. Like the reason we're talking about meditation in the first place is you were using it as a distinction between that which is scientific and that which is a part of understanding the world that is not scientific. That's the whole reason the meditation example was used, because you were saying that this is not where science can tread. And then I've given an example where science.
No, but you've given an example
like.
about something that I don't dispute that science could do, but not at the fundamental thing. If I'm trying to find out not what my blood pressure will be or what I'll report to have experienced over in 6 months from now, but I'm trying to figure out the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality. Do I go the scientific approach to this is going to be very different than the say the Zen approach or the Dzogchen approach, right? Like you're going to go about it differently. And in terms of the criteria of thinking, okay, I actually think I've experienced this. It's not something I can articulate to anybody. So whether somebody asked me about it or not, I could say yes, but that would just give you information about what I say. In terms of being able to talk about what it actually is, that's not something I can do, and not something a scientist can get at, because this thing is prior to concepts. It is non-conceptual. It is purely experiential. You have to, it's just not something, you can test whether people say that they've had some kind of radical experience, non-dual kind of experience. But in terms of trying to figure out what that means and what that is, that doesn't seem to me something that science can get at.
Maybe would you accept
it can dance around the periphery of it.
Maybe let me just try and change the example just to try and sharpen up the distinction. So would you accept this replacement? So someone takes DMT, they think they visit aliens or something, right? I think Tamler wants to say, how are you going to adjudicate that scientifically? And Vaden wants to say, well, you can ask them surveys about whether they had some crazy trip. And the people that took DMT are going to say yes.
But they have a good alternative explanations for why they think that they visited aliens, right? And the question of whether they visited aliens is something you can easily articulate and maybe test for, or come up with theories of, well, how was it that you... But this is not like that. You can't articulate it. You do have a fairly well fleshed out theory of how you arrived at this and why you should believe it. And it's just fundamentally immune from a scientific corroboration, whatever you Popperians say about why to trust a theory or not. They would say, yeah, it doesn't meet a lot of Popperian virtues, and specifically that it's not falsifiable.
Yeah, I would just want to answer slightly differently than Vaden and just say it's perhaps immune from science right now, but the whole point of coming up with new theories is we'd slowly work at the edges of okay, you say you're experiencing this, now let's and I know maybe you're allergic to MRI experiments, but as they're carried out right now. But in practice, I think you could do experiments where someone is claiming to have achieved some mental state. Okay, you show them, you poke and prod them in this way, and then you ask, and you try and figure out if the kind of sensations that they're reporting are true and things like that. So I think there are ways, and it's maybe hard to imagine right now, but this is the point of new theories.
That's just not
you're trying to.
Yeah, but this is the thing. Theories involve words and concepts, right? And this isn't something that does. And so you somebody say, first of all, it's just insane to think, oh, I've achieved this mental state. Let's just put you in an fMRI and then prod you around and think, oh, that can shed light on the nature of what it is that you've experienced, or what you're the metaphysics you're tapping into. That's just, no, it can't. It's just not in principle, not in in practice. It's completely laughable. It's also in principle not possible. You would just get readouts. You would just get the things that are going on in the brain. That doesn't tell you anything about the nature of what this person is experiencing. It's just completely different levels of explanation. It can just give an explanation for, I don't know, why it is that they might say that they're doing something.
Let me just fully grant that having the experience of something is, you have to actually experience it, and that current tools aren't there. And so this is it's so analogous to when creationists or people say, well, science will never tell you what the experience of falling in love is. You have to do it. And in some sense, that's absolutely true. But there are all sorts of other questions that can be asked about the phenomenon of love that allows
Sure.
us to make and additionally, as they, I don't know, let's fast forward 1,000 years, just make believe for a second. Let's say we have like perfect whole brain emulators and crazy uh, simulations and blah, 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 all that sci-fi stuff that I typically don't like to invoke. But if you just grant that that's not impossible, that maybe in 1,000 years we'll have tools that will be much more sophisticated than MRI machines, then yeah, science will give us insight there. And finally, when you go and you say, "Oh, I've heard a lot about this thing. I know that I'm not going to go into an MRI machine and learn anything about it, but I am going to go to a meditation retreat." That's running an experiment. That's doing science. That's doing personal, individualized science. It's you thought about a thing, you have a prediction that if you do this for a couple of weeks, you'll get this experience. You try it. That is science in the sense that I'm using that term. And so, in all these ways, science absolutely give you insight into the
So, okay, maybe that's a good place to maybe wrap up because I have to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I agree with that. Like, I think that the reason you should, if you choose, decide to engage in meditation practice, it's just, I want to try this. I want to see if this is good for my life. I want to see if this maybe gives me a different kind of insight into what's going on. And and if it doesn't work for me, I'll stop. That's like how you do it, right? It's like, I think it's the people who do it because they read some study that says, well, you're going to be, you'll rise to anger 0.3 seconds later or something
we
like
all
that.
Agree
That's
it.
That's insane. That's crazy, right? Like, no, just try it. And if it works for you, great. And if you decide to continue it, that's also great. I guess the thing so I agree with that, and I think that is science. I think that you're trying it. It's a practical choice. Yeah. I think though, if I'm trying, once you get into the weeds of what it is, when you're further, way further along than I can even conceive of down this path, and versus say what physical theories are saying, or and you're trying to decide which of, and maybe your point is I don't need to decide that, but if I'm trying to think which of these approaches I should trust more, if my ultimate goal is to just understand the nature of consciousness or the nature, I don't know if even if the Buddhist path doesn't have the Popperian virtues that the scientific path does, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's less reasonable for me to choose the Buddhist path rather than the scientific path. But I guess your point is I'm choosing a scientific path even if I take the Buddhist path, because that's like a localized scientific choice, a conjecture that I'm making.
For sure. Like the quote Popperian approach, and then this will be the last thing I say on this subject, is the following. It's to recognize that MRIs are useless to give us any sort of insight or knowledge into the kind of question that we're seeking. And so the best thing to do is to run a personalized experiment and go frickin' try the thing. That's Popperian.
But it will never be falsified. It can always be that either you didn't have it in you or you just didn't get it.
So Popperianism is not equivalent to falsification.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe that. All right. So
let's leave it there.
Maybe a good place to wrap up. Hopefully, this reminds people of the OG days of Very Bad Wizards when you and Dave used to argue. Sadly, you're too aligned. So hopefully that brought out some of the fire in you, which is what we wanted. That's what we're here for.
We're gonna get back to some disagreements. I find he dodges central questions about his discipline in a way that soon I'm at least at some point we have to have it out again, fully.
So I'm wondering, just as a way to synthesize the combo a bit, if you'd accept this merging of the views, which is maybe we didn't fully resolve the problem of induction for you, but we moved it from this question about justifying predictions to more about like preferring certain kinds of theories, which in my mind is a much deeper question than just like what gives us the right to think that certain things are going to happen tomorrow or not. And I know you still have hesitations about, okay, how can we ultimately justify those theories and why care about these criteria and things like that? And there's questions there around like, I kind of want to say that's a pseudo problem and you don't. And, so we're not going to resolve that here. But I'm wondering if you accept that maybe we moved you at least to that, what I would consider a deeper question than sort of the prediction question.
Yeah. I mean, you have. I mean, I guess, let me think about this before I fully concede. There's a lot of predictions that I make that I don't have well worked out theories about. And I think I am basing it on regularities in the past. But I think if I'm trying to determine whether I have good reason, like what reason do I have to prefer one prediction over the other, often then I think maybe what I'm doing is just implicitly appealing to some kind of theory that. So, yeah, I guess I'll grant you. Now my head is like, you guys just wear people down. I think that's the Popperian way.
Yeah. Welcome to the Popperian cult, Mr. Tamler.
I think that's what Popper did himself. The man wrote so many books and essays over the course of his life. People were just like, fine, we concede. Nice. All right. Well, we didn't get time to ask you about your book, sadly. So hopefully we'll have to come back on and debate about the, statistics and its relevance and its philosophy at some point.
Yeah.
That would be fun.
I might be bugging you with a few questions. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, nice talking to you guys.
This is awesome. Thanks so much, Tim.
Thanks a lot.
All right.